point I have is the formation of the International War Crimes Tribunal in 1967. So at the beginning of the war, only a small percentage of U.S. citizens were against it, including those who marched in opposition to U.S. involvement in the March of 1964. So as war continued, more and more U.S. citizens started to grow opposed to the weapons that were being used, such as Agent Orange and napalm. And in 1967, Bertrand Russell formed the IWCT, and this organization was against U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. So they claimed the weapons the U.S. used against North Vietnam were prohibited by law. They claimed that the U.S. was guilty of torturing captured prisoners and innocent civilians, and claimed their behavior was comparable to Nazi behavior. So this ultimately convinced society's mindset to develop against the war and rapidly increased the number of Americans who opposed it. My second turning point is the Tet Offensive of 1968, and this is when North Vietnam conducted surprise attacks on the U.S. Embassy in South Vietnam. This was kind of their all-or-nothing attack because of their desperation to end the war. They were unsuccessful at capturing the building, but their actions did plummet U.S. self-confidence and made the U.S. realize that war wasn't over. This continued social opposition to war and extended wartime, putting an even bigger strain on society. The U.S. citizens were even more against war at this point and were discouraged because it just wouldn't end. My third turning point is the invasion of Cambodia in 1970. So President Nixon was elected in 1968 because he promised to end the Vietnam War. The U.S. liked the idea of this and even realized that the military operations seemed to have winded down. That is, until Nixon ordered troops to invade Cambodia, land west of Vietnam. I found this ironic due to his reputation and the reason why he was elected in the first place. Nixon also never consulted Congress before the invasion, and he was accused of illegal involvement in the war. And so the public was shocked to see this happen because they elected Nixon to end the war. His action made those opposed to U.S. involvement come together and conduct protests. My fourth turning point is the Kent State crisis of 1970. So after the invasion of Cambodia, the next day there were violent clashes at Kent State University in Ohio. These protesters were throwing rocks at police. They were making bonfires in streets and hitting police cars with glass bottles. The next day, the National Guard was sent after the protesters set a university building on fire. And then May 3rd was a peaceful day before the shooting that occurred on May 4th. So during the students' peaceful protests, the National Guard ordered dispersal of these protesters, and when they disobeyed, witnesses saw these guards fire shots into the crowd, killing 4 people and injuring 9. So I thought this was symbolic of the division in public opinion on this controversial matter. It kind of fostered a disillusion of what exactly can be solved by protests, and it brought upon fear of prospective interaction with government officials and how they would deal with protests in the future. So the Vietnam War ultimately changed the U.S. by bringing upon different views of law enforcement, questioning the U.S. democracy and how much citizens actually had a say in what was happening. It questioned the morality of the officials and why they felt the need to bring in rifles with the protests. It questioned what weapon is off limits when dealing with protests, and should there even be weaponry involved in protests in the first place. It kind of had me wondering, in what scenarios will protests actually get through to government officials, and when and why can the administration determine the validity of a protest. And so I think this ultimately just brought the U.S. citizens together and furthered the divide between government and its citizens. And so I think America's international relations are better in a way that we know what world peace should look like and we know how to get there.
but it is worse because of the current leaders that we have and all of the threats of, like the nuclear bombs. And so, given my topic, I think communism and democracy did coexist in the way that both sides did want the war to end. And I think there was a benefit that came with this competition. There was a better sense of the extent of the competition and what damage it could bring upon. And I also think it didn't benefit because it inhibited world peace and it brought upon deaths of many innocent people.